one thing we changed. That's one thing we were like, we got to change the name. But I think taking a bit of organization, also saying, you know, let's not, one of the things I loved about SAPAC was we went away for a weekend retreat to do the bulk of our training. And there's something different that happens when you take your whole self outside of a campus environment and integrate experiential learning with, you know, sort of skill development. So that's one thing that we were able to do. And I'm gonna try to be quick. I think, also, it seemed like some of the programming here was done kind of piecemeal. There was no organization around when something happened. So one thing I was able to just translate from Michigan was in the fall, Sexual Assault Awareness Week, and in the spring, Rape Prevention Month is what it was called at the time. And organizing events and trying to really get at things like intersectionality. How do these issues affect different folks in different ways? And also, and I have to give a lot of props to the student leadership within RSVP, people like Eliza Solovier and Malika Anand and different folks that were really involved with RSVP doing innovative programming. Like, what if we got the poets from Chicago to come in and do something where we're integrating poetry and other kinds of expression? So that's a little bit of stuff we brought with us. And then my last, I think that my proudest moment was being able to call up Vickie and say, who I need to leave, who should take over, and I was thinking Vickie's gonna recommend somebody. I couldn't believe the great Vickie Sides. I was like, well, I might wanna do this. Very happy about that.
Thank you. And many of those programming structures that you put in place, we still maintain to this day. So the training retreat is very important part of RSVP. Thank you. All right, Rachel. Yeah. You've been doing anti-violence work over 20 years in Chicago. You've done prevention work in non-campus and campus contexts. What are some of the major cultural shifts you've seen over time in campus prevention work, and how have those shifts coincided with what was or is happening in the public sphere?
Oh gosh, okay, so I am going to try to keep it real and keep it short, but I'm not famous for that. But I thank you for structuring that question in that way, because I think that campus work and general anti-violence work is growing and shrinking in parallel ways. And so I remember when I was in college, there was like sex offense services, we were called. We were like the rape crisis group, SOS, right? It's like all very alarming, right? And then it was, you know, like a couch and then lots of hushed tones and whispering, are you okay? And then, you know, like there was a lot of, in the early 90s, there was like this huge no means no push, and this huge push to get even sexual violence to be recognized as something that was harmful, right? And I think that that was also what was going on in the movement, is that we were working to establish with, you know, like a baseline, let's everybody agree that raping people is wrong. And we're mostly there, right? And so I think that what has happened though on campuses is that once we got everyone to understand that sexual violence was a thing, and once we got everyone to understand no means no, then the conversation switched into bystander intervention and consent-based work, which is where we are now largely. And inside of that, and while all of that was happening, there became this sort of like institutionalization that happened, that not only happened on campus but off campus, right? When I started doing this work in high school and, you know, college, this was not a job you could have, right? Like there was no such thing as being like the rape person on campus. You were like the person with the single dorm room in the basement of a like dorm where people would come and talk to you about their experiences. And now there's an office, and there is money, and there's budget, and there's that sort of thing, and there's funding, which is really amazing. Also, like once you become institutionalized, then you also become beholden to a lot of institutional structures. And that is also a complication that's happening off campus and on campus, right? People this sort of became a movement that was deeply like personal is political kind of movement into like personal is like liability issue for an institution. That's this page. I'm getting ahead of myself. But these are some trends that we've seen on and off campus. And I think that one of the things that we haven't, like in the ways that we've done off campus and on campus, we sort of broadened what interpersonal violence means, right? And so back in the day, there used to be, you know, like we would do these Take Back the Night rallies, and they would be really, you know, as our friend Ann Russo, who works on DePaul's campus, wrote this brilliant essay, like Take Back the Night from whom? And so we were still like a little bit married to this idea about like stranger danger, right? And we've moved into recognizing that sexual violence, A, works on a spectrum, but B, is also embedded in our culture. And we talk about rape culture much more than we did before. And so we've taken it out of that sort of individual level or like a scary one person, and we've broadened it, but we haven't done a good job of broadening it enough. So we don't think about like scary one person, but we're like indistinguishable frat guy now is like our boogeyman. And that's sort of, I think what we're seeing off campus as well, right? And we see in our society, we're thinking about sort of like generic rapist, right? That we see on Law and Order SVU, and he's like a banker or a lawyer or this sort of thing, but we don't really think about how we've embedded rape culture in all parts of our culture, right? And so we don't think about power-based violence. And so I think on campuses, much like off campuses, we're not thinking through, we say rape is about power, and we say rape is not about sex, it's about power. And then we are happy to stop there, but then we don't talk about what power means and what abuse of power is. And like the spectrum that we talk about when we talk about sexual violence is like we started at sexual harassment and ended at rape, instead of like starting it at sort of other systems of domination, capitalism, racism, white supremacy, and end it at like settler colonialism or, you know, whatever, right, gentrification. And so we much like on campus and off, like cut the conversation. We like pull out the middle part of the conversation and dive deep in that. And then we sort of like expect a different solution. So we also expect a solution when you're only focusing on the middle part of the problem, which is kind of leading us to where we are now with sort of the Me Too movement. I had to talk about the Me Too movement, although like I complain about the Me Too movement so much, but then people bring me to campus and pay me to talk about it, so I should just be like, keep it going, people. Keep it going. But like the Me Too movement is really exemplary of where we are on and off campuses about how we talk about sexual violence, right? Because people are now, like people feel safer and people feel more emboldened in telling their stories, and there's so many more venues for amplifying your story, which is wonderful. And I think that it's wonderful and terrifying because we're realizing that like people are still experiencing violence and committing violence at epidemic proportions, at epidemic rates. But what we aren't doing is thinking through how like quickly we turn a disclosure into like dragging somebody on the internet and then like demanding justice that is also super individualized, not about a culture shift, and also about a punishment versus accountability, right? And so this is kind of similar to what we've seen on campus with like the rise of Title IX. I mean, Betsy DeVos is gonna get rid of that, so whatever, I might be, you know, whatever, that's also, but we talk about, you know, like the way Title IX works and the way sort of lots of campus-based organizing work is really similar to how we're seeing things in the Me Too movement work, where people are asking for very individual punishments and responses to people's individual like harms, which I think is really useful to address the individual, but we're not seeing culture shift. And what we are seeing is the use of power to harm in a way, like as a means to address the power. That was, you know, so like we are fixing violence with, yeah, it's still power driven. We're still fixing power with power. We're still fixing abuse with abuse. We're still fixing sort of like shunning and shaming by shunning and shaming. And that is, sort of, I'm so Debbie Downer. Everyone's like, oh, we did such a good job. And I'm like, everything is terrible. Everyone's like, and so I think that there is a lot that, like, campuses are and aren't reflections of what's going on off campuses. And we imagine campuses to be these little bubbles, but they're not. They are, it's like a feedback loop of what's happening off campus. And as we grow into like a movement that's in our second or third decade, we have to think about what we're doing when we're institutionalizing ourselves, and what kind of, like, when this becomes a job instead of your work, what do we want to make of that, right? And so as we're imagining how universities themselves are changing, we have to think through like what the role of institutions that confront power are going to do within universities as they change.
Very good, thank you. All right, Kelsey. Kelsey, what makes doing prevention work on UChicago's campus important to you? And do you believe your experience here is unique?
So I don't think I can really talk about my experience in prevention work at UChicago without talking about how I got involved in sexual violence work generally. I never really felt like there was the option not to be involved. I think my involvement started in a rather unusual way in that I am a writer. I'm very interested in telling stories. And when I was 14, I decided I wanted to write a story with a rape survivor in it. So I started looking up people's stories on online forums and reading them to figure out what are the things people talk about, what is this experience like. And what I realized was that it had absolutely nothing to do with what I expected people to talk about. And that sexual violence is very different than all the things I had already at 14 internalized about sexual violence. And I figured out, I don't think other people know about this. I went through all of high school without ever talking about consent and without these stories ever being addressed. So I was always looking for a way to bring these stories out and to get people to engage with them and understand them. So when I learned about RSVP and I was told there's a peer educator group where you go and talk to people about sexual violence, I immediately had to join. And that's kind of what's made it important to me, is the desire to bring these stories to the forefront. At the time that I first got involved when I was 14, I did not know any survivors. I was not a survivor. And now I do know a lot of survivors, both personally and professionally through being a victim advocate. And it's become increasingly important over the years for me to be able to get people to engage with these stories and to listen to the stories of people around them. As for what's unique about working at UChicago, I think one thing that's unique is how small the undergraduate community is. You're really only one person removed from everyone else on campus. And so when there's any kind of drama, everybody knows about it. There used to be a Facebook page called UChicago Secrets, which, for those of you who don't know, is an anonymous forum where people can just submit things. So naturally, it's kind of vile. And there's also a number of rumors that get spread. So people will post, will just submit anonymous stories about, oh, this happened at this particular frat, and no one really knows how to address it. And that's a very unique thing that I think we end up engaging with, is when we go and speak to students in the community, they have these questions about, I saw this on UChicago Secrets, or I've heard this kind of going around the rumor mill. And we're kind of the people that they're able to talk to about this and what they should be doing about it and how they should be engaging with this. Another unique thing, I think, is how ideas about rape culture and rapists match up with ideas about UChicago culture and who UChicago people are. So Rachel mentioned that we have the anonymous frat boy as our boogeyman now. And that's been a very interesting idea to work with on UChicago's campus, because UChicago's conception of itself is very quirky. And the conception of UChicago masculinity, I think, is pretty different than a lot of other places. There's jokes about the squirrels being more aggressive than the men, which, in fairness, the squirrels are quite aggressive. But that is an interesting thing that comes up, is UChicago men do not see themselves as aggressive because they think of physical aggression a lot of the time, and they think of sexual prowess, which they don't believe that they have, for the most part. And trying to get them to see rape as going beyond like this strange frat boy or this strange football star, and as to see it like power-based violence, to see it as entitlement, and to recognize how much entitlement there is in UChicago culture, even if it's not the athlete football star entitlement that we're used to seeing at UChicago, there's a lot of academic entitlement. You're very used to being told, you're the best, you deserve this, you should get what you want, don't take no for an answer, keep pushing until you get the A, or you get to be valedictorian, or you get that internship. And that's kind of the thing that we engage with in a pretty unique way on campus, is getting people to recognize the forms of entitlement that they're really used to, and seeing how that affects their interactions with others.
Thank you. All right. So now I'm going to shift to talk more specifically about primary prevention work. And I want to make clear that RSVP's focus is primary prevention. And if you look at like CDC definitions of prevention, and those aren't the only ones, primary prevention is the work that's done to ensure that an injury or a disease never happens in the first place, right? There's secondary prevention, which looks at sort of mitigating the impact after it's done, and then there's something called tertiary prevention that sort of looks at long-term management of the effects of injury or disease. But we focus on primary prevention. So I'm going to tell a little anecdote that I use in training a lot. It's not mine, I didn't make it up. But the anecdote are about two people standing on the banks of a river having a conversation, and a person washes down the river in distress. And they fish the person out, they bandage them up and send them on their way. They continue to stand there and have that conversation. Another person washes down in distress, they fish them out, bandage them up, send them on their way. This happens multiple times before one of them says, hey, one of us needs to go upstream and see what's happening. Why are the people sort of washing down the river in distress? So when I came to RSVP, it was very important to me to sort of take that upstream approach to doing the prevention work. To say that for all the years that I worked at a rape crisis center, it really was about bandaging the wounded, and that's really important work. I don't want to suggest that it's not. But for me, it has to be coupled with the work that sort of stems the tide, right? Stops the flow of people coming down. As I've heard Rachel say many times over the years, like our goal really is to work ourselves out of a job, right? That should be our goal. So considering the anecdote I just told, can each of you say a bit about how you personally made the connection to upstream work and talk about the importance of that for doing effective prevention work? And we can start with anyone. Anyone.
Wait a minute, I'm getting a couple of messages. I think that's a great analogy, and I think the work at University of Michigan also really came from a primary prevention work. And again, that was one thing that it was already happening here on campus, but continuing that idea of focusing on the connections to what leads to gender violence. And again, even in the mission statement of promoting healthy gender relations on campus. And I think Rachel and Kelsey really articulated well the analysis of power, the analysis of the campus climate that contributes to that. I think it's really important work. It's kind of elusive. You know, some people need to get convinced that there's even this continuum. Wait a minute, how is sexual assault related to how we're hanging out, how are we showing up in the space and just having a conversation about X? And I'm also very aware of like what kind of spaces do we create, who's coming in the room. I'm interested in the folks that anybody and everybody, because this affects all of us. You know, this whole notion of how do we get beyond preaching to the choir? Mm-hmm. So to me, and in my experience here at U of C, it was more challenging to have workshops happen, like in classroom settings and things like that. So we ended up leaning more heavily on programming and trying to be innovative. How do we get people in the door? You know, and then have the dialogue based on the movie or the art piece or whatever it is that we were displaying. So I've been transformed by primary prevention. My time at Michigan was my biggest growth trajectory around a lot of things that I do nowadays. Having said that, there's also another piece around activism that I was challenged in my position here at RSVP, because here I am so focused on consciousness raising, and then one student who was the peer education coordinator, Malika Anand, really challenged me around, look, we can talk till the cows come home. What about rolling up our sleeves and doing, you know, and you know, the older curmudgeon-y side of me was like, well, I kind of like what we're doing now. But it really, it was a growth area for me, and I think it's so important. It's great to hear the tripod that you were talking about activism being one of the aspects. And I think we can probably credit Malika for bringing that to RSVP. So I think primary prevention is important, but I think this synergy of doing consciousness raising with action, and then just trying to create enough space so everybody can feel like they can locate themselves and figure out where they are in this system.
And if I could tag along with what your comments were, Rahul, and then later, you know, I experienced working with you, and then you took what Rahul had started with the peer, and Monica had started, and moved it forward with the activism piece even more. And what I found sort of as the administrator sitting here at the table, my consciousness piece of the need for activism, so thank you for saying that, and Kelsey, you described something so articulately that we were faced with, and this was what was it, 10 years ago, practically, that we were faced with that was sort of this nebulous thing in the room, like, do we really need RSVP? You know, do we really need, you know, even the sexual assault being so called, which was another system, and to a certain extent from the administrators, you know, like, well, what are they talking about? And then we get to the activism, what are they going to do? So there was that sort of curiosity and concern and even fear, because this is the University of Chicago, and you know, things like this don't happen. So from the administrative level, sort of protecting, and again, I used the word protecting, I think several times when I was talking about it earlier, and I'm even being more aware of that feeling of trying to make sure that you could do the work that you could do in a protected space, and the sort of, do we really need it issue was there. And as sort of you mentioned Title IX and other issues sort of to grow and evolve, there was more of a, well, yeah, we do need this. But what role will RSVP, and when we talk about policy and making sure that students have voices, we want that, but then how far does that go? And I just remember the times when, and there may be someone in this room who will remember, like, there was some concern. There was concern about where would this go and what would that mean for, you know, the reputation of the institution. And it gets to that issue that you talked about, you know, and yes, our students are fantastic, and with that we needed here. So the activism piece definitely was a wake-up call for me, and I didn't think at the time, I wouldn't even use that. It's just like, I used little activism for what I was doing, but it was still trying to be protected to give you space to do what you needed to do.
Thank you. I'm going to jump in because I've been thinking about that upstream metaphor ever since Vickie left me at the Rape Crisis Hotline to go upstream. Not bitter. 12 years later. Hold on. And like, what's hard for me is like, I think I've moved away from picturing it as an upstream, downstream situation. And it's more in my mind like a whirlpool, right? Because I think that we do prevention work as if people already are not survivors and perpetrators in the room. And that like, that's not a safe assumption to make. And that like, we, you know, and so like, it prevents us from having actually really hard conversations about that time you did this thing, or the time, you know, like I think that by the time especially people get to college campuses, like a lot of like society will have gotten to people already. And so it's not, you know, and then so I think that we are sort of also swirling in this pool where we don't think about, like, when we think about the downstream work and the patching people up, that is to me actually the upstream work, because the ways in which we're in helping people learn how to heal are sometimes rooted in also really problematic ideas about power and entitlement and what justice looks like for an individual, right? And so I know that when, you know, like as a survivor, and when you watch Law and Order SVU, which I've never watched Law and Order. I'm an OG classic Jerry Orbach person myself. More quips.
Yeah.
But we imagine, like, we teach people, it's not your fault, but we don't be like, it's actually the patriarchy that imbues every single aspect of our lives, even from when you get on the bus, right?
Yes.
So like, we don't tell them that. We tell them like, this person didn't have the right to hurt you, like you did not deserve this, this was not about their, like wanting sex from you, it's about power and control. And then we're like, and so here, fill out this police report and then send them to jail where they are going to be raped. And then we actually, as a society, really love the idea, right? Like, let's think about that judge that sentenced Larry Nassar to prison, and not to say that he doesn't deserve, like, he needs, this is to say, he needs to be held accountable, but then we have, like, evolved as a movement to, like, give people cheers for being like, I hope you go to prison and get raped too, right? And so like that, like even when we're talking about healing, we're actually creating more harm doers in a lot of ways because we're not teaching people to divest from like problematic institutions that are power abusers, right? And so like the downstream work and the upstream work for me, really, we need to start a lot earlier in asking people what their power is for and how they think, who they think is a person and who is not a person. And that really, like, before you can be like, this person in my dorm room, like, says no, but they really mean yes because I'm awesome. And, that I'm just like, I'm like Mr. Guy or Miss Lady or Miss Person. Like, before they get to that point, there's a lot of things about like, I'm an American, I'm a citizen, and as a citizen, I deserve X. Or as a like person with an education, I deserve Y. Or like, you need to do this for me because I occupy this social location. And if you harm me, you deserve to be a non-person anymore. And so even before they get to the place where they're causing that individual harm, we've already taught people about entitlement, as Kelsey has said. And so I think that we have to start, we have to really start examining, like culturally, we have to do the activism pieces, but we also, as a service provider, hardcore, have to start thinking about what we do when we invest people's healing into something super individualized. And it wasn't always that way. When like people started doing this work, when Ida B. Wells was doing this work, when people were doing this work in the 70s, survivors were activists, right? People organize, like people healed through organizing, and people healed through finding people and making social changes. It wasn't like, I mean, I'm no shame to therapy because who doesn't need therapy 3 times a week? Down to 1. But like, like it's not about individual therapizing, and it's also not about kicking an individual off campus. And I think we need to start helping people think about healing as a connection to larger social justice movement, and that is part of the upstream work for me.
I think you brought up a really important point of how we can cheer for sending some people to go to prison and knowing that inevitability that they'll experience sexual violence. Because I do think it still reinforces the idea that there is a way you can earn sexual violence.
Yeah.
And there's a point at which it's deserved. And so it is really negative because it's so easy to turn that back on people and you're like, well, maybe you did do the wrong thing and maybe you are a bad person and that's how this plays out. I also think you made a good point with keeping the audience in mind, where we don't necessarily think about there's a survivor and a perpetrator. And that's actually something we started doing at RCT, and something that comes up at every retreat, is you should always go into a workshop assuming that there is a survivor in there and there is a perpetrator in there. And we have had those experiences of hearing afterwards or finding out during the presentation, like there is a survivor and there is a perpetrator in the
And
room.
sometimes they're the same person.
Yeah.
And there can be very uncomfortable moments. Like we've had moments where people have asked us hypothetically if they assaulted someone during a workshop in front of like 40 people. So this is something you have to prepare for and think about. I'm gonna have to say the same words to a lot of different groups and a lot of different experiences at one time.